Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're on a fascinating mission analyzing leadership, power, and the whole complex burden of responsibility.
And we're doing it guided entirely by a very specific stack of ancient sources.
Yeah, we're diving deep into passages from Acts 15 and, well, the really explosive critique you find in Matthew 23.
Our goal is to dissect the typology of leaders presented here.
The king versus the servant.
Exactly. And the self-led versus the spirit-led. And we're trying to uncover the operational truth behind whether a leader's choices make the yoke they place on others heavy or delightfully light.
And when we talk about this yoke, it's not just some poetic metaphor for a burden, is it? It's a very specific term.
Mm-hmm.
In the ancient world, a yoke was, a physical wooden crosspiece. It went over a pair of oxen to harness them for work.
Right, but in a rabbinic context, carrying a yoke meant accepting a discipline, a doctrine, a whole way of life.
And the stakes here are just immense. I mean, this principle is completely timeless.
It really is. Whether you're leading a team, managing a business, running a household, or even choosing political leaders, the core question is always there.
Is the relationship defined by, a crushing weight, or is it an empowering partnership?
At the end of the day, the quality of the leader dictates the quality of the follower's life.
Okay, so let's jump into Acts 15. We land right in a moment of just extreme tension.
Oh, yeah.
Paul and Barnabas, they've just wrapped up their first missionary journey. They come back to Antioch and find this colossal theological fight brewing.
The big one. Must Gentile believers be circumcised and follow the entire strict Jewish law?
And this is where that idea of the burden, the heavy yoke, it's just front and center.
Mm-hmm. They take the issue to the apostles and elders in Jerusalem, and Peter, he gets up and he frames the entire debate around this unbearable weight. It's in Acts 15:10.
Right. He asks, "Now therefore, why are you putting God to the test by placing a yoke on the neck of the disciples that neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear?"
It's such a powerful statement.
It really is. What's fascinating is how Peter identifies the law, at least when it's imposed as a requirement for salvation. He sees it not as a guide, but as an impossible, crushing burden.
A heavy yoke that history itself proved no one could actually carry.
And that context, it just immediately throws us back to Jesus's really radical counter-teaching, doesn't it?
It has to. You have to read them together. In Matthew 11, Jesus just flips the entire concept of the yoke on its head. He doesn't say, "Come to me and I'll remove all burdens."
No, he says, "Take my yoke upon you."
Exactly. Because my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The difference between an unbearable, externally imposed load, the law, and an invited restorative discipline, the way of Christ. That's the central typology we're exploring.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. Let's dive into that first core contrast. Leaders who act like kings, focused on self, versus leaders who act like servants who are focused entirely on seeing others flourish.
We see that king leader archetype played out so tragically right at the start of Israel's monarchy with King Saul.
Right. When the people of Israel decided they wanted a king, like all the other nations.
Mm-hmm. The prophet Samuel gave them this crystal clear warning about what that would actually cost them, socially, economically.
He detailed the heavy yoke this king would impose. Samuel warned he'd take their sons for the army, their daughters to be, perfumers and cooks.
He'd confiscate the best of their fields, their vineyards, their orchards. He'd even tithe their servants and livestock. The message was just so clear.
A king leader takes.
A king leader takes. And Saul became the ultimate expression of this. Here's a leader who's perpetually concerned with his appearance, his stature, what's best for him.
So his leadership was fundamentally extractive.
Totally. It wasn't about building up the nation. It was about protecting his own insecure position. And when a leader is defined by taking the system they create, it has to be inherently heavy for everyone else.
Yeah.
It's a burden that's based on fear and self-preservation.
But then, and this is where it gets really interesting, you have David. He also holds the title of king, but he completely redefines the role. He wasn't perfect. I mean, far from it.
Not at all.
But he was called a man after my own heart. So what were the specific behaviors that shifted that outcome from heaviness to lightness?
Well, his actions were just rooted in this radical self-sacrifice. Think about that anecdote of David on the battlefield. He just expresses a wish, casual thought, that he'd love a drink from the well near Bethlehem.
Which was behind enemy lines at the time.
Right, occupied territory. And immediately, 3 of his mighty men risk their lives. They fight their way through the Philistine ranks just to get this water for him.
An incredible act of devotion.
It is. Now, a Saul-type leader, a king leader, would have taken the water, praised their loyalty, maybe promised them a promotion.
Right, a king leader consumes the sacrifice.
Yes. But David,
Hmm.
David looks at the water, and instead of drinking it, he pours it out onto the ground. He literally pours out the physical manifestation of their lifeblood and their risk.
And he says, "Shall I drink the blood of the men who went at the risk of their lives?"
That's it. That is the pivotal difference. David, the servant king, he understood his role was not to have his men risk everything for his comfort.
His role was to mitigate their risk and elevate their lives.
Exactly. That single act, pouring out the water, it created this environment of trust and fierce loyalty that no amount of forced taxation or military service could ever achieve. That is the light yoke in practice.
The leader absorbs the cost.
And the followers gain confidence and purpose?
I think we sometimes forget how immediately this applies to our own lives. We use these ancient examples, but the source material is essentially giving us like a corporate guidebook.
Absolutely.
How hard our daily life is, the heaviness of the yoke we carry at work. It often just comes down to leadership style.
Micromanagement, for example, is a classic heavy yoke.
Oh, definitely. Demanding constant reports, eliminating any autonomy, focusing on process over results.
Right. The modern king leader is the one who hoards information, takes all the credit for successes, and then externalizes blame for failures.
And the environment they create is one of fear.
Whereas the servant leader, they empower, they delegate fully, and they take responsibility when things go wrong. That empowerment is the light yoke. It's responsibility that's shared and supported, not mandated and then abandoned.
Okay, let's pivot and look at a different version of that self-focused leader. We move from the king to the religious authority. Let's go to Matthew 23, where Jesus is just delivering this blistering indictment of the scribes and Pharisees.
This transition is so crucial because it shows that whether you lead through political power, like Saul, or through moral authority, like the Pharisees, the whole system collapses when the focus is on self.
Jesus addresses the crowds, and he acknowledges that these religious experts, they sit on Moses' seat.
Which is a key phrase. It means they hold the legitimate teaching authority.
But the instruction that comes right after that, it's just devastating. He tells the people to practice and observe whatever they tell you, but not what they do. For they preach, but do not practice.
It's the ultimate do as I say, not as I do failure. And it reveals the psychological burden of their kind of leadership.
And here's the parallel to Peter's complaint in Acts 15. Jesus says they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on the people's shoulders.
But they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They create this spiritual and moral atmosphere that is just impossible to navigate with integrity.
So the burden here is hypocrisy. When the leader demands perfection but models failure, the followers are just crushed under the weight of an impossible two-faced standard.
And this weight is made even worse by the legalistic focus Jesus slams them for in the woe sections.
Right, he says they're meticulously tithing the smallest spices, mint and dill and cumin.
But they completely neglect what he calls the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness.
That detail gives us such a critical leadership insight. It's not that tithing mint is wrong.
No, not at all.
But that their energy is totally misdirected. They focus on the minutia, the easily quantifiable externals, while ignoring the massive, difficult, life-altering concepts of justice and mercy.
I mean, think about that in a modern context. It's the executive who spends hours making sure the expense reports follow procedure perfectly.
While actively cheating their workers out of fair wages.
Exactly. They're straining at a gnat while swallowing a camel. And this hyper-focus on outward purity, it makes their converts, their proselytes, twice as much a child of hell as themselves.
Because they've taught them that outward performance matters more than internal character.
The sources make it so clear that this kind of leadership is focused entirely on outward appearance. They do all their deeds to be seen by others.
Yeah, they look like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but full of death and corruption inside.
So this self-serving leadership, whether it's political or religious, it always leads to heaviness. It has to. Because the leader's need for appearance overrides the follower's need for an authentic life.
The core principle just stands. Everything. The health of a family, a company, a nation, a church, it rises and falls on the quality of its leadership.
And integrity is the foundational element that determines the yoke's weight.
Okay, that brings us to our third crucial contrast, which really offers the solution to self-serving authority. It's the difference between self-led leaders who only trust their own judgment
And spirit-led leaders who seek counsel and place themselves under accountability.
Let's go back to the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15.
This council is just a masterclass in institutional humility.
Hmm.
I mean, Paul and Barnabas had just come back from a wildly successful mission.
They were the rock stars.
They were. They had the spiritual authority. They had all the momentum. They could have just declared, we believe the Holy Spirit wants the Gentiles to be free from the law, so that's the new rule. But they didn't.
No, instead, they modeled this collaborative, accountable leadership. They travel all the way to Jerusalem to seek counsel from the apostles and the elders.
And they essentially placed their wildly successful ministry under the authority of others.
That humility is the key, isn't it?
It's everything. Good leaders are never so arrogant or so confident in their own rightness that they aren't willing to subject their biggest decisions to critical review.
They might believe they've heard God clearly, but they acknowledge the possibility of, human error or confirmation bias.
Or just personal preference
Yeah.
coloring their judgment. So they listened, they heard Peter's testimony, they heard Paul and Barnabas' reports, and then finally James's summary and his proposed resolution.
And this whole consensus-seeking process resulted in a decision that was backed by the highest recognized spiritual authority.
And just listen to the language they used in the final letter.
Mm.
For it has seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay on you no greater burden than these essential requirements.
So greater burden, that's the deliberate administrative choice to create a light yoke.
It is. They established only 4 necessary requirements for fellowship, and they stripped away all the cultural and legalistic weight that the king leaders, the Pharisees, wanted to impose.
And that spirit-led, consultative process, it achieved the goal. The sources tell us that when the letter was delivered and read to the Gentile believers, the people rejoiced because of its encouragement.
The immediate, tangible result of light yoke leadership is joy and encouragement, not pressure and exhaustion.
That's the ideal outcome.
Right. But the sources are also ruthlessly honest about the human element. They quickly remind us that even the best leaders are, well, profoundly imperfect.
Just human beings.
Exactly. Who are prone to bad judgment, bad attitudes, and sometimes very public failure.
And they demonstrate this point immediately at the close of Acts 15 with one of the most unexpected and dramatic events in the whole book.
The sharp disagreement, the nasty argument between Paul and Barnabas.
It's stunning when you read it. The setting is simple. Paul says, let's go revisit the cities from the first journey.
And Barnabas agrees, but he wants to take John Mark along.
And that's where the conflict just ignites. John Mark had previously withdrawn from them in Pamphylia.
In other words, he quit. He bailed on the mission when the going got tough.
So Paul, who is known for his relentless focus on mission efficiency, he understandably refuses. He thinks it's best not to take someone who's unreliable.
But Barnabas, who was John Mark's cousin, was perhaps prioritizing the relationship, or maybe offering a second chance.
So here's the question we have to ask, right? Tying it all back to the servant leader typology. If Paul is supposed to model the light yoke, how do we reconcile his seemingly harsh, uncompromising decision about John Mark? Isn't he imposing a heavy yoke on Barnabas and denying John Mark the very mercy they preach?
That's the tension. It's so real. Acts 15 tells us a sharp disagreement arose, so severe that they separated.
They had a public, ugly breakup over a personnel decision.
And Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus, and
Wow.
Paul chose Silas and went a different way, strengthening the churches.
So what's the lesson here?
Well, it highlights the deep complexity of leadership ethics. You have 2 leaders, both anointed, both successful, who just came from this massive spiritual victory.
And they split over a matter of, what, integrity versus compassion.
Something like that. And yet, the divine narrative doesn't condemn the split. Instead, God seems to multiply the mission. Paul and Silas go one way, Barnabas and Mark go another, and they effectively double the missionary force.
So the lesson isn't that sharp disagreement is good.
No, but that people sometimes get things wrong and sometimes make mistakes. Even the most spirit-led leaders have flaws, blind spots, and uncompromising moments.
The reassuring takeaway is that God remains sovereign and uses imperfect vessels.
And sometimes the best outcome for the work is, in fact, a temporary split.
So what this all means is that you can't wait for the perfect leader because they just don't exist.
They don't. But you can demand integrity in a servant heart. The choice of who we follow, whether the highest office or the smallest team, it fundamentally determines the quality of life we experience under their authority.
So as the sources implore us, choose your leaders well. Look past the charismatic exterior and search for the servant heart, the humble spirit that seeks counsel.
But, and I think this is even more vital, we are all leaders somewhere. So we should strive to be a leader that somebody else would be willing to choose. A leader who places a light yoke on those around you, whether that's your children, your colleagues, or your volunteer team.
Because everything rises and falls on leadership.
It does. And for those aiming to integrate these timeless principles, the challenge is clear. Step up and lead in whatever capacity God opens the door for, and do it with integrity, with sacrifice, and with the humility to constantly seek guidance.
That leads us to the final provocative thought for you to carry forward. The sources demand character and integrity from leaders, yet they also show that Paul, David, all these great figures were deeply flawed. So what is the precise practical line in our modern organizations or even in our family structures where we must definitively separate from a leader because of their fundamental flaws or hypocrisy? And when must we, like the apostles who saw value in Barnabas' separate path, just continue strengthening the core work despite the unavoidable imperfection we see in the process? We'll let you wrestle with that difficult practical tension. Until next time.